Welcome to Noctelle. Some things are hidden for a reason. And today, we're breaking that silence. What if one man's obsession with conquest led to the deaths of tens of millions? And what if the very decisions he thought would guarantee victory were the exact ones that destroyed him? This is the story of how Adolf Hitler gambled everything on a single invasion. One battle after battle after battle, and still lost it all. In the early months of 1941, deep in the Bavarian Alps, Adolf Hitler sat in his mountain retreat, planning the most audacious military operation in human history. He called it Operation Barbarossa, the full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler never hid his hatred for communism. He despised it to his core, but more than ideology, he looked east and saw something irresistible: vast open lands, endless natural resources, oil, grain, minerals, everything Germany needed to dominate the world forever. In his mind, conquering Russia wasn't just a military objective, it was destiny. But here's what makes this story fascinating. At this exact moment, the Soviet Union was technically Germany's ally. Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, and he was desperate to keep it alive. Why? Because his army was broken. In the late 1930s, Stalin had purged his own military. 3/4 of his senior officers had been executed or thrown into prison. The Red Army's most experienced commanders were gone, replaced by inexperienced men who feared Stalin more than they understood warfare. Intelligence reports flooded into Moscow warning that Germany was preparing to attack. Stalin refused to believe them. He was so terrified of provoking Hitler that he ordered his forces to do nothing that might offend the Germans. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Before turning east, Hitler needed to secure his southern flank. In April 1941, German forces tore through Yugoslavia and Greece with terrifying speed. Belgrade surrendered in less than a week. Athens fell in under 3 weeks. The path to Russia was now wide open. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, over 4 million soldiers launched the largest military invasion the world had ever seen. 3 massive army groups struck simultaneously. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group Center aimed straight for Moscow. Army Group South targeted Ukraine and its rich agricultural lands. The German Air Force destroyed Soviet airfields before planes could even take off. Within 2 days, tanks had punched more than 50 miles into Soviet territory. The scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. Near Minsk, German pincers trapped over 300,000 Soviet soldiers. In many parts of Ukraine, German troops were actually welcomed as liberators by people who had suffered terribly under Stalin's brutal policies. But that illusion of liberation would shatter quickly once Nazi occupation policies revealed their true nature. In Moscow, Stalin appeared to suffer a complete nervous breakdown. He went silent for over a week. It wasn't until July 3rd that he finally addressed his people, appealing to their patriotism to save the motherland. Meanwhile, in London, Winston Churchill saw an opportunity. Britain was no longer fighting alone. Churchill declared that any enemy of Nazi Germany was a friend of Britain, regardless of past political differences. He immediately sent a delegation to Moscow to sign a mutual aid agreement. Now here's where Hitler made his first devastating strategic mistake. His tank commanders were begging to push straight for Moscow. The road was open. The Soviet defenses were crumbling. But Hitler ordered his forces to divert south toward Kiev instead. He wanted Ukraine's resources before taking the capital. His generals were horrified, but none dared challenge him. This decision cost weeks of precious time, weeks that would prove absolutely fatal. The Kiev operation was a spectacular military victory. 500,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. But those lost weeks meant that when German forces finally turned back toward Moscow, autumn had arrived. And with autumn came the rain. Russian roads turned into rivers of thick mud. Tanks sank to their axles. The lightning advance ground to a crawl. Then came the Russian winter. German soldiers, who had been told the campaign would end by summer, had no winter clothing. Men froze to death in their positions. Weapons jammed. Tank engines refused to start. By early December, advance units were just 19 miles from the Kremlin. Some scouts claimed they could see its golden domes, but that was as close as they would ever get. What the Germans didn't know was that Stalin had received intelligence confirming Japan would not attack Siberia. This allowed him to transfer over 500,000 fresh, winter-equipped troops from the Far East to Moscow. On December 5th, these forces launched a massive counterattack. Soviet artillery opened up first, then waves of T-34 tanks smashed through German lines. The Germans fell into chaos. Hitler fired his commander-in-chief, took personal control, and ordered that there would be no retreats. His forces would fight and die where they stood. The line eventually stabilized, but the myth of German invincibility was shattered forever. By 1942, Hitler needed a new strategy. His original plan of attacking across the entire front was no longer feasible, and Germany was running dangerously low on oil. He turned his attention south, toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. But then he made another catastrophic decision. He ordered the capture of a city called Stalingrad. The city had no immediate strategic importance, but it bore Stalin's name, and for Hitler, taking it became an obsession. What followed was one of the most brutal battles in human history. German forces fought their way through the city street by street, house by house, room by room. Soviet defenders used sewers for movement, rubble for sniper positions. Progress was measured not in miles, but in bodies. Then, in November 1942, the Soviets sprung their trap. Over 1 million soldiers, backed by 13,000 guns and 900 tanks, had been secretly moved into position. They struck both flanks simultaneously, and within days, the entire German 6th Army was completely surrounded. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. He promised supplies by air, but his forces needed 700 tons daily and never received more than 80. A rescue attempt by German armored forces came within 30 miles of the city before being driven back. On February 2nd, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus surrendered. Over 100,000 German soldiers marched into captivity. Only 5,000 would ever return home. The rest perished from cold, hunger, and disease in Soviet prison camps. After Stalingrad, the momentum shifted decisively. The Soviets pushed westward relentlessly. Hitler, refusing to accept reality, planned one final summer offensive at a place called Kursk. Here, a massive bulge in the German lines seemed to offer the perfect opportunity for a devastating pincer attack. Hitler pinned his hopes on new superweapons. The massive Tiger tank weighing 55 tons with near impenetrable frontal armor, and the faster, more agile Panther. But Soviet intelligence knew exactly what was coming. Marshal Zhukov built the most elaborate defensive system in military history. Multiple layers of trenches, hundreds of thousands of mines, concrete bunkers, barbed wire stretching for miles in every direction. He also secretly amassed enormous reserves for a devastating counterattack. On July 5th, 1943, just as German forces prepared to launch their assault, Soviet artillery struck first, a massive bombardment that caused chaos before the battle even began. When German tanks advanced, they ran into a prepared killing ground. Every mile cost thousands of casualties and hundreds of tanks. Then on July 12th, at a small place called Prokhorovka, 900 fresh Soviet tanks smashed into the exposed German flank. Nearly 2,000 tanks from both sides clashed in the largest armored battle in history. After a single day of savage fighting, the Germans lost 350 more precious tanks and began falling back. The Battle of Kursk cost Germany 50,000 of its best soldiers and over 700 irreplaceable tanks. It was the final turning point. Never again would the Germans launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From this moment forward, the Red Army would advance relentlessly westward, liberating Soviet territory, pushing through Eastern Europe, and ultimately reaching the heart of Nazi Germany itself. But the war was far from over. In the West, American forces approaching the German border in late 1944 were about to stumble into a nightmare that history has largely forgotten, a place called Hurtgen Forest. This dense, 140-square-mile forest had been fortified by the Germans since 1938 as part of the Siegfried Line. It was a defender's paradise. Tanks couldn't maneuver. Aircraft couldn't see targets through the thick canopy. Radio communications failed completely among the dense trees. General Courtney Hodges, commander of the 1st U.S. Army, ordered his forces straight into this death trap instead of simply going around it. What was supposed to be a quick reconnaissance turned into 5 months of grinding bloody hell. Unit after unit was fed into what soldiers called the meat grinder. One regiment lost a man for every meter and a half of ground gained. Casualties straight out of World War I. The forest swallowed divisions whole. Soldiers fought without adequate food or water because supply lines couldn't keep up with the advance. Minefields were everywhere, some with a mine every 2 meters, stretching for kilometers. Men crawled on their bellies trying to find and disarm explosives while being shot at from fortified bunkers they couldn't even see. The horror culminated when Hitler launched his final desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, just south of Hürtgen Forest in December 1944. German forces punched a 60-mile bulge into Allied lines, catching planners completely off guard. But unlike the chaos of Hürtgen, the Allied response was organized and well-supplied. By January 1945, the offensive had failed. When the forest was finally cleared in February 1945, between 33,000 and 6,000 American soldiers had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. Yet in his memoirs, Supreme Commander Eisenhower devoted fewer than 70 words to a battle that lasted 5 months. In March 1945, American forces crossed the Rhine. 2 months later, the war in Europe was over. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12 years, built on the delusions of one man who believed he could bend history to his will. He couldn't, and the price the world paid for that delusion was measured in tens of millions of lives that can never be brought back. The lesson of this story isn't just about military strategy or political ambition. It's about what happens when leaders refuse to listen, when ego overrides evidence, and when the cost of stubbornness is paid not by those who make the decisions, but by those who must carry them out. History doesn't forget, and neither should we. If you found this story interesting, you should check out my previous video where we explore another moment in history where everything changed, but almost no one realized it at the time. And if you enjoy deep cinematic storytelling like this, subscribe to Noctelle, because here history is not just told, it is experienced.